The Trail of Tears was the forced migration of numerous indigenous American tribes from their ancestral lands in the U.S. Southeast to new territory in Oklahoma. The journey resulted in the deaths of over 4,000 Native Americans along the way. But what was everyday life on the Trail of Tears like? Well, today we're going to take a look at some of the brutal realities of everyday life on the Trail of Tears. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, we'd be much obliged if you would leave a comment and let us know what other indigenous American topics you would like to hear about. Okay, let's walk down this Trail of Tears. On May 28, 1830, U.S. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a document that authorized the American government to extinguish Indian titles to lands in the nation's southeast. That act also authorized the president to negotiate with native tribes in order to gain access and make improvements to their lands, as well as offer resettlement funds to those tribes and groups willing to move west. Even in its own time, the act was highly controversial. While many Americans, particularly those in the South and the largest state, Georgia, supported its passage, many others opposed the act, including a large number of Christian missionaries and several sitting members of Congress. Indeed, it was only after a long, bitter series of debates that the act finally was passed by the legislature. While its ultimate goal was to turn those lands over to settlers, the Indian Removal Act did not explicitly grant Jackson permission to forcibly remove native inhabitants. Nonetheless, the 5 so-called civilized tribes, which included the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole, as well as the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Lenape, were all ultimately removed from their lands, and force was often a major factor. The tribes were sent west on a trip that would eventually become known as the Trail of Tears. Native Americans, still ubiquitously known as Indians among the white population at the time, weren't terribly popular in many of the states the Trail of Tears took them through. Therefore, at numerous points along the journey, they were forced to go many miles off the main route in order to avoid towns and cities where residents simply did not want them to come through. In some of these places, the landowners would charge them fees to cross over their lands. And not surprisingly, those fees weren't cheap. For example, after traveling through Tennessee and Kentucky, the Cherokee reached southern Illinois, but they had to cross the Ohio River to get there. To cross the river on a ferry, the Cherokee were charged $1 a head, the equivalent of $22.26 today. Other users of the ferry, meanwhile, typically paid a mere 12 cents, which was the equivalent of $2.67 today. A soldier named John G. Burnett, a private in Abraham McClellan's company who was assigned to help translate on the Trail of Tears, recorded his memories of the trail on his 80th birthday. In those memoirs, he pulled no punches, and, based on his first-hand knowledge, he characterized the trail as the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. While Burnett's recorded memories provide many deeply moving and personal details from the trail, it is his recollections of the brutal weather faced by the travelers that he refers to the most. And the natives who walked the trail were, indeed, forced to face harsh weather. In May of 1838, for example, the Cherokee were rounded up and put into stockades in Cleveland, Tennessee, until October of that year, when they finally began the trail. This means that they had to complete the 1,000-mile journey in the dead of winter. As Burnett remembers, many were forced to walk in bare feet with only the thinnest blankets for warmth, as the sleet and snow fell on them. Due to the cold and exposure, many contracted illnesses like pneumonia. An untold number succumbed as a result. Picture this scene. After being removed from their ancestral homelands and forced by the U.S. government to head to an unknown place in order to survive, hundreds of sick and dying Native Americans struggled to travel across miles of freezing, desolate land. And as they persevere, spectators stand along the sides of the road, offering no help or relief, but rather staring on in silence, watching for their own interest. It sounds cruel, but that's exactly the way it happened. Consider, for example, the testimony of Samuel Cloud, who turned 9 years old on the Trail of Tears. His story was recorded by his great-grandson, and among the many sad reminiscences that Cloud recounts, the very ending of his story stands out in its perversity. Cloud recalled that by the end, he hated the white people who lined the roads in their woolen clothes that kept them warm, watching the Indians pass. Native Americans weren't the only ones who wound up walking the Trail of Tears. Piling one injustice on top of another, many of the Cherokees brought their slaves along the trail with them as they moved from their homeland in Tennessee to the land allotted to them in Oklahoma. These enslaved African Americans were not only tasked with dealing with the incredibly inhospitable conditions of the trail, but they also had to serve their Cherokee masters while they traveled. They hunted for food and prepared it, washed clothes, cared for the sick, guarded camps, and served as scouts along the trail.